You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
All right, Hayden. So I know you're in a new location now. You got a new backdrop over there. I see you don't have the. We got to get that calling trophy back up. How was the move? Are you settled? Is everything good? Yeah, just talk about that a little bit because I know I personally haven't heard much, and that's a lot of work to go through.
Moving sucks. I'll tell you that. Moving sucks. It's not my favorite thing to do. No, all settled now. Just if you've ever moved, I assume most people in their life have moved at least once, but you get to this point where you move everything in, you set yourself up in your new home, your new place, and then there's like 4 or 5 boxes left, and you just go, you know what? I don't know where I want the stuff. Can't be bothered. Probably either A, I think time to get rid of it. It's not necessary if you don't know where it is or where you want to put it. But I've gone with option B at the moment, which is it's just still sitting kind of off to the side in the kind of like dining area. So, I'll sort that out at some later point. But no, good. Got to find some artwork that I want to fit here. I might rearrange this sort of like second bedroom office space a little bit. I have some like space off to my left here that you can't see, which has my plants and my trophies at the moment and my books. So I need to work on that.
So just haven't gotten around to putting the trophy up yet.
But they're both sitting here. I've got the Nationals and the Calling Trophy sitting here, but they're sort of just shrouded in dust at the back.
Yeah, same actually. Yeah, I totally understand that. I feel you just sitting over there and kind of in the corner. Anyway,
once the World's Trophy's there, I'll get that organized.
Yeah. I mean, if I just had space for it, I'd probably put them up, but I can't. How about your week in Flesh and Blood?
Yeah, really good week in Flesh and Blood. Where as we record right now, we are 2 weeks, or I leave in 15 days to the World Championship. By the time this pod drops, it'll be 2 weeks out from Worlds, which is super exciting. It's getting pretty real, right, Brendan? I know, for you, it's a bit different this time, but I'm sure equally as nerve-wracking with what you're about to do. And for me, I think it's just about locking in decks, getting in reps, working out. This mid has been interesting and preparing for, in a way, 3 formats. I'd say I've done less preparation for draft this time, but on Sunday I went and did a few drafts with some very some well-known Australian locals. The Tall Timmy was there, Fluke and Box was there. I know you love the Tall Timmy, Brendan. You guys are good pals, so he was there. We did some drafts, and then I got some blitz testing in, which is also been interesting. So just getting ready not long now, and it creeps up very quickly, especially with life thrown in as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yourself?
I mean, I've been playing a lot of Talishar, so I'm playing about like 5 hours a day now. My schedule's a bit more free than it was before I went on my trip. Let me dispel the myth that is casting is anywhere close to as stressful and as nerve-wracking as playing, because it is not at all.
I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, maybe if that was something that I guess made you uncomfortable, but for me, it's definitely. I don't feel the weight, right, that I would if I was going into a 3 format kind of world championship, despite how much we've been preparing and despite how prepared I sort of would feel at this point for that format. It's still, there's a lot to unpack there when you got Blitz, Class Constructed, and Uprising. I've got upcoming this weekend, so leaving on Friday for the Ohio Battle Hardened, which I will also be casting and not playing, joined by Flake DeMarco and Charmer. Derek Oswald is his name. But yeah, very excited for that. Playing a lot of Fab. And 2 weeks, like you said. It's actually not very long until I completely dip out of the testing process here and sort of go on my path as a caster. Try to talk to some more players, get some more stories, get the backgrounds, and get ready for the job that I'll actually be fulfilling at that tournament.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you're going to bring to the table, and I don't know if people will really realize this, because obviously you are picking up the casting role this time around, but you've been super involved with the testing process as well for the group that we're testing with this time around, which has been cool. So we're indebted to you. I think it'd be interesting to see. I mean, you're going to sit in that booth and you're going to feel pretty across this meta, I think, which is cool. And I just want to shout out there. You just got Charmer's name right, Derek. He must feel like you guys are best friends, because Brendan notoriously names, not your strong suit.
Very good with names, actually. It would have been very unusual for me to forget that name. Anyway, Hayden, we've got some pretty interesting news. So I think we talked about last week is the Dynasty spoiler season originally set to occur. Not now. Thought it was going to be in like that condensed period usually is, but it seems we've been drip fed some of these Marvel spoilers. But why don't you start us off with, I think, one of the most exciting spoilers, and surely one of the more exciting ones for you.
I'm pretty pumped. I actually thought just before we jumped in, I thought maybe you could just give us a top line because we do have a guest jumping on the show today after we talk spoilers, we talk some news, we've got a great Command Cookout question, and then when we get into the main topic of the pod, it's a pretty great main topic, Brendan. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who's joining us and what we're going to talk about, and then we can jump into some awesome Dynasty spoilers.
Yep, returning guest that we all know, Mr. Michael Hamilton will be joining us. We're going to be talking about fab mathematics. Doesn't sound super exciting if you don't like math, but this is really the core behind basic Flesh and Blood, and I think it's a concept, probably the most important concept to, I guess, if you're a beginner or intermediate players, to really understand the value of cards, the value of your hand, how to play turn cycles, and how to get the most value against your opponent. I think Michael Hamilton is absolute master when it comes to fab math, and the way he breaks it down. And a good example is I was listening to the Manor podcast and I heard Roger Bodie talk about Zealous Belting and the Sledge Van Vilheim. Thought that was one. He said this is one of the most powerful things that the Guardian can do. And Michael Hamilton quickly rebutted by simply pointing out the math and seeing that it was actually almost identical to just 2-card Wounded Bolt. But these are things, they are basic in their nature, but I know for me, it's a concept that escapes me more than it should. And I think kind of a core lesson in fab math is something that everybody can use to level up in Flesh and Blood.
Yep, definitely. One of my favorite topics, and who better to come on and talk about it than someone who's been utilizing it to, I'd say, quite a bit of success recently. So
a little bit.
Before that, Brennan, the news and Dynasty preview season continues to be now, apparently. So we've had some awesome previews and spoilers come out from different content creators around the world who have been granted, this kind of early release, early access to show these awesome marvels, which has kind of been driving the hype. I think it's pretty smart, to be honest. I thought when I saw the first few, I was like, oh, interesting. We're going to get a couple now, and then we won't hear anything for 2 weeks, and then it'll be preview week, and it'll all just flood in. But I think quite a cool way that's been done this time is these marvels have all been sent around the world to different creators who have been able to, and players, and not just content creators actually in this fashion, and to release and show these cards. And that's the kind of previews that we're getting up until the actual preview week starts, and then it's going to hit, right? Like we're going to have preview after preview, day after day, right, for that sort of really condensed period. So I think this makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about some of them. Rock. You can't go past Rock. Brute Weapon, Rock. I love that the type of the weapon type is Rock as well. Like it's called ROK Rock. The weapon type is Rock with a C, 2-handed Brute Weapon. If you haven't seen this card, once per turn action, 3 cost attack, and you can only activate Rock if you have no cards in hand. Damage that would be dealt by Rock can't be prevented. What a cool card. I really like this card a lot, Brendan.
Yeah, so give me a use case of this card. How do you set this up? How are you swinging this card? Like what immediately comes to mind for you with how to utilize Rock?
Yeah, so it's important to know you can't, like if you have a card in hand, a blue card in hand, you can't pitch that card to activate Rock because you have a card in hand, and the cost happens on activation of the ability. So you can't activate the ability with the card in hand. So the ways to do it is to have floating resources and then find a resource from an onboard ability as one good way to do it. So, you could use something like Deep Blue, for instance. Take your last card in your hand, Deep Blue, come in with Rock. You could pop an energy potion with 1 resource floating from overpitching on the previous card. You could, overpitch, have 2 floating. Tunic is probably going to be a common way we see Rock used. The Talisman that allows you to pitch. There's a few different ways to get extra resources and be over the resource count. Overpitch, etc., and be able to activate Rock. And I think we're going to see, I think the initial kind of look is going to be like, oh, okay, let's throw some barraging beatdowns in the mix. Let's pop an energy potion and a tunic, and let's like come in with a big Rock turn. I have a 4-card hand. They're all, I've set up for all barraging beatdowns or all intimidate effects, whatever it is, or all pump effects, primeval bellows, things like this. And then we dump them in and we come in, we smack with Rock, as people like to say.
Yeah, I think Deep Blue is a pretty good way of activating this, and I immediately see it probably seeing success in Blitz the most, but we could see more cards to help you facilitate having these resources while having no cards makes Rock more viable. Also, I assume that a lot of the time you might be rolling Scabbies to be able to swing it, but maybe not. I think it's a really cool
Maybe go
card.
again.
I also think that
maybe.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say maybe go again attacks could be the way to do it, right? As well, like you use your hand beforehand. You just keep a 4 or 5 card hand and you just bomb it on the table effectively and get it all down. But I agree with you. I think Blitz will set first because this is hard to set up, right? And it might be a once per game kind of thing to be reliable.
Yeah, I do just want to point out that these sort of Marvel card frames are quite good looking. Flesh and Blood seems to step it up sort of set by set. Last we had the Marvel Dragons, which were unbelievably gorgeous, and now these pieces of equipment, they look amazing. And I think increased customization in this game is definitely a plus. So I think that these Marvel equipment are wins for me so far.
Let's move to the next one. We're not going to go through all of them. We just picked out a few that we do want to talk through, and very interesting, I think. Another one is a Blazing Yori. So Blazing Yori is a ninja equipment chest, defense 1, and while it's defending on chain link 4 or higher, it has +4 defense, and it has Blade Braid. So you're only going to defend with this once. But if it's on chain link 4 or higher, it's going to be defending for 5. So it's a little mini husk, if you like, if it defends late into the chain link. Very interesting card, Brendan. I think it's going to be interesting to see the utility of this card because not many decks present 4 or more chain links other than, I would say, Ninja Mirrors typically.
Yep, Phi. This is seems like it's tailor-made for...
Maybe.
Yeah, tailor-made for Lava Burst. Just like clean blocks Lava Burst on the 4th chain link. I think that this is actually... I remember seeing in like a group chat people being a bit underwhelmed by this, but I think that this is like immediately... in most ninja decks as an equipment slot, if there's any sort of ninja mirrors, especially the version of 5 that we see running around right now. And I would be very surprised if this doesn't make almost every ninja blitz list as a piece of equipment to have access to. So I think I honestly think this is a staple.
I agree with you. I think the chest slot is super interesting because it's the chest slot is a really powerful slot, and I think it's one that LSS have been really careful with. And Tunic is such a staple, right? But I think that was done on purpose. Like give this really strong staple in the first set because they want to be really careful with the chest slot. We've seen, like hard and cross trap, right? Like just the power of that card in Blitz, for example. Like there is power there. I think they want to be careful of it. And so, but this card's really interesting to me. I think, like you say, if you're expecting any kind of ninja mirrors, it's immediately in your deck is a wide kind of boost dash in the format. It's going to be in your deck, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I'll let you talk about this next one, Brennan. Surgeon Aethertide. Bring us into, what are your feelings finally getting another wizard weapon? We've got a few now. We've got, 4 wizard weapons now? 5 wizard weapons.
Yeah, but some of them are kind of bad. So Surgeon Aethertide, this is a wizard weapon staff, 2-hand. It says once per turn action, 2 resources, deal 1 arcane damage to an opposing hero. Go again. This is the first wizard card with Go Again. The first card you play each turn with an arcane damage effect. Instead, it deals that much arcane damage plus X, where X is the damage dealt by Surgeon Aethertide this turn. So, I mean, this kind of looks like I don't know, it seems worse than Kraken's Aethervein initially. I mean, and of course you have Crucible of Aetherwave, which is an instant speed and costs 1 less, but the thing that gets me interested about this weapon is plus X. So that could be future proofing on the templating, but does make me think that they might come out with some effects that help you increase the damage that Surgeon Aethertide does.
Yeah. I thought that initially, and then I remembered that if they did that,
Kraken's Aethervein would be broken, yeah.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So I'll hold my breath on that one. I think this is more about templating, to be honest. And this card effectively says, Crucible of Aetherweave is 1 cost plus 1 to your next card, right? Mm-hmm. This you're paying extra resource to effectively deal an extra damage, but get +1 still. So you it's kind of like Crucible. When you buy a new phone and they're like, hey, do you want this like this normal size version that's already massive and is already going to do the job for you, or do you want this plus version which like has these extra features? That's kind of what Surgeon Aethertide is to me at the moment, but we'll see where that goes. I do just want to point out as well, it's the first weapon with Go Again, but there is a couple of wizard cards that have Go Again, right? Sturdy Aetherwinds, for example.
Yeah, I feel like this is like the Huawei version of Crucible.
Don't knock Huawei.
I'm actually, I don't know. This card, I feel like we need more. We need to see more of the Dynasty set and get more context. It doesn't immediately sort of pop out as like this is going in my Wizard deck over Crucible.
What's your thoughts on the Marvel art though? It's very dark, I would say.
I mean, it looks dark on my screen. I didn't know if that was like a resolution thing or something like that. But yeah, it's not a lot of color to it, but I don't mind it. I mean, it could look better in person. Who knows? But yeah, I'm really interested to see what they do with Wizard. We've already seen two somewhat unusual cards come out, right? This one with the weapon, and then also this sort of aura effect that bumps your next wizard, and I think it pops on the following turn. So I think we're going to be expanding the sort of the design space for how a wizard can potentially be played.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Blessing of Ether, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Is the card you're talking about. Let's move on to the last card we're going to talk about. And there is a few more that have been previewed this week. I recommend going and checking out. I always get this wrong. Is it Fab Rary? It's like library and Fab, right? It's the database deck builder that you can use online, and they've got a Dynasty spoiler list actually, which is where I've just pulled this from. But the last card to talk about is the November Armory Kit Rainbow Foil promo, which is Predatory Streak. Which is this is at red that we've seen this. Not sure if there's going to be a yellow and blue version as well. I assume there would be based on the wording of this, but it's a ninja action, defense for 2, and says create 3 crouching tigers in your banish zone. You may play them this turn. Go again. And the big question, of course, is what are crouching tigers?
Yes, I have zero context, and I know a lot of people have had a lot of fun speculating on this. I have not. Well, all I wonder is about Hidden Dragon. To be honest, I think that this is the question that's big.
I first thought also.
Yes, if Crouching Tigers are here, Hidden Dragon must be the finisher to said combo.
Is that Jet Li? I always.
Gosh, I don't know.
Okay, so Dynasty preview season is going to continue. I think we're going to see a few more Marvels. Looks like it's going to trickle in. I've seen a few people say they've got cards to show this week, and then of course. Week after next, the week of Worlds is preview season. Do just want to shout out again. Our preview card is on November 2nd. Any hints? Because you've seen our preview card now, Brendan. I know you got it in the mail. Yeah. We're going to be showing that. We want to give anything away? Can we give anything away?
So what I would give away is it's a Majestic. It's an absolute staple, and yeah, I think that decks that run cards of this type will run 3 of this card at the very least. Yeah, that's probably all we can say right now.
Probably.
But it's definitely 100% a staple, just from the math value, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So
there we go.
What
a lead in today's pod, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Elsewhere in the news, do just want to shout out. There's a few things that have been announced for Worlds, including a Dev Challenge. I'm not sure if you've seen this, Brendan, but if you finish 9th to 16th, you will get an invite to this Devs Challenge. I think they're calling it Dance with the Dev Ills. Play on words there for ftcg.com. So a lot of the devs are going to be at Worlds, which makes sense. I think, in fact, maybe the whole dev team, or at least a big chunk of the dev team. So a lot of the original devs of the game, 6 of them are going to be there. And then there's invites to the remaining top 16 so not top 8, so 9th and 16th of Worlds to form this event, which is going to happen on the Sunday, coinciding or potentially at a slightly different time. I haven't seen the exact details, to the top 8 for the World Championship. So that should be interesting. There's a gold foil legendary and some cash on the line. So just something like a rapid charge, second chance for 9th to 16th, and you get to play against, players that don't really play the game publicly. So it's going to be a spectacle to watch as well, I think. I hope they record some of these games.
What format is it?
It's class constructed.
Yeah, I was going to say if it was Blitz, I would ask Mr. Jason Chung, actually open invite Jason Chung, Brian Gottlieb, all of them. They can play Kano, and if they win, I'll give them my gold Stormstriders. It's not going to happen.
Well, be careful with that one. There's also 2 slots for community members, I think, being given out. I want to say, I can't remember how they're giving out the last 2 slots because it's a 16-player event. So 8 from the top 16, 6 devs, of course, and then 2. I think they're from side events. So if you're playing in particular side events, you can actually get an entry potentially to this event. So that's really, really cool as well. Each of the Friday and Saturday classic constructed daily doubles gets you a chance to get into those. So Very, very cool. Also want to cover, there's at the World Championships, they've now announced there's a judge conference, and that's happening, I think, on the day before. Really cool to see that they're wanting to help upskill the judges in Flesh and Blood, and I think that's been obviously a conscious effort over the last few events. If you are interested in that, I would recommend going and checking out on fabtcg.com. Maybe you're a level 1, level 0, level 2, whatever it is, and you want to get involved with this, then all the details are there. Battle Hard in Columbus this weekend. Brendan, you already talked about it. 10K at the Realm Games. You're going to be casting. What are you looking out for this weekend? Is class constructed, right? So we're going to see maybe a bit of a hint towards what we might see for Worlds.
Yeah, for sure. I'm particularly interested to see how Icelander does. Icelander won the U.S. National Championships and then the SEG Con at Hard. There actually wasn't a lot of Icelander there, and it did not perform well. So I'm interested to see if Icelander sort of comes back. If not, I think that we're going to be in a more Oldhim centered format. In terms of like the ice pillar of the format, I think it'll be more Oldhim than Icelander. But probably the marquee of the event, I think, is this Combo 5 deck that Peter brought to SEG Con in Dallas. I think that deck will start to be widely adopted. It might become actually the deck as we head into Worlds. I would not be surprised to see that as the most popular deck.
Cool. Looking forward to seeing some coverage and I guess your mug on the coverage as well. I want to give a shout out to 983 Media, Tan and Grace, Matt DeMarco, and Ubershouts for this Goliath Gauntlet series that's happening right now. If you haven't seen it, it's awesome. It's such a good, I think, initiative that's happening between now and Worlds over the next couple of weekends. Both Brendan and myself have been playing in this event. My game's already been streamed and is available to go and watch. It was the first weekend or the first day of the Goliath Gauntlet over at 983 Media. You can go check that out. Interesting game. And Brendan, I think yours is being your first round is being shown this coming weekend.
Mm-hmm. Mine was also an interesting game. The funny anecdote from it is that me and Caleb, or better known as Madge and Bay, played one match where we recorded, and it lasted it was an Icelander Bullander mirror actually. It lasted about 10-15 minutes, which is extremely quick. Trading damage. We both had almost no idea what was going on in the mirror. We turned off the cameras and you want to play another? Which is very unusual. I'm kind of a snap no, do you want to run it back for funsies kind of guy. And we did it, and it lasted about 70 minutes, and it was just an absolute chess match and grind. We learned so much over those two games. It was incredible. It was funny to see the difference in the dichotomy between the two games that were effectively back to back. But yeah, Caleb's a great guy and an amazing Legends of Runeterra player, and I would go on a limb and say an amazing Flesh and Blood player as well.
Yep, agreed. So yeah, go and check it out. I think the series is really cool. I won't spoil anything from my game, but my game was, I think, actually ended up being a little bit longer than that. But
it's my favorite match, to be honest, of the whole thing. I loved it.
What's yours?
No, yours.
Yeah, go check it out. New deck tech is up on the Arsenal Pass YouTube page. As we record, it's probably dropped about 24 hours ago from when you listen to this, or potentially could be listening to this. Speaking of Goliath Gauntlet, I have shown the Rhinar deck that I played. I really enjoyed playing this deck. As Brendan well knows, I spent probably the first few days before we got into proper testing, or the first week and a bit, revisiting Rhinar. Brendan, you can attest, basically every time a new format comes around, what's the first thing I go to? Is Rhinar viable?
I think it's just, what's a C tier deck? And then that's it. Rhinar Dash.
Yeah, Dash might be better than Rhinar, I think, probably in this meta. So yeah, did end up playing this Rhinar deck. I think it's quite a spicy deck, I think, and you can go and check out this deck tech that I did for that. And of course, the guide is available, Cyber Guide, deck guide is available on the Arsenal Pass Patreon. But for this time, I didn't tell you this, Brendan, but I've decided to do this because I think it's a great way to showcase what we do on the Patreon. Is actually, this one is available to anyone. So you can actually click through on the link. It's a public post. You can see this deck tech and Cyborg guide for this Rhinar deck that I've done. And you can just, maybe you're not a Patreon, maybe you want to know a little bit more about what we do with these deck guides and deck techs when we do one, or when we have a guest come on and they write one for us, and you can see kind of what this is all about. It's a full Cyborg guide and some matchup notes, etc., and some more notes about the deck that aren't covered in the deck tech just due to time. So yeah, I recommend just going and have a look and see if you'd like what we put out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of it, Brendan. Just last one. Shout out to all of the Arsenal Pass patrons. Thank you. And I think we've got some cool stuff coming in the very near future, which I think we're gonna probably release potentially to patrons first. We haven't decided yet, but we've got some stuff coming. I don't know timelines, but that's all safe now, right?
Yeah, it's a boxing match between me and Zach Bunn. Pay-per-view. All right, let's get Michael on here and let's head into the main topic of the pod. All right, everybody, we are joined by Michael Hamilton to talk about today's main topic of the pod, which is mathematics in Fab, or Fab Math. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, we are big fans of yours. I think we have you on here more than any guest at this point, if we include deck techs. You're definitely sort of, I think you're pioneering sort of a new way of looking at Flesh and Blood, and this is reflected in a lot of your decks, whether it be Oldhim or your recent Bullander list, but a more quantitative way of looking at the cards, rather than sort of this boomer or traditional way of looking at focusing more on synergy rather than just pure quote unquote value. You've taken that sort of philosophy to major success since you started the game, and I think that we all have something to learn from you at that. So to introduce can you just introduce this idea of math and fab, or value, and the value of a card, the value of a turn cycle, however you would like to sort of jump into that?
Yeah, so basically Flesh and Blood, it's like a giant game of math where you're trying to get more value out of each of your cards than your opponents. Each turn you each get 4 cards. So if each of your 4 cards is worth more on average than each of their 4 cards, you're probably going to win the game. So the easiest way to take the value of a card is how much damage it does or how much life it saves you. So if you look at a card like Red Scar for a Scar, if you are behind, then it does 4 damage if you play it to attack, and it doesn't take your action point. There's no extra real cost there. It's just 4 damage for a single card. And that's a pretty good rate most of the time. 4 damage for a card is generally higher value than most constructed decks get out of their average card. But obviously the ceiling is much higher than 4 damage for a card, and the floor is definitely lower. If you look at a lot of other cards that just block for 3, when you block 3 with them, you're getting 3 points of value because it's saving you 3 life. And yeah, that's kind of the basic way to value a card. And then your total value per turn is the value you get from all 4 cards in your hand, how you use them, and how much life they save you or damage they deal to your opponent.
What would you say is the average value, or sort of maybe even the quote unquote intended value of a hand in Flesh and Blood? Is it something like 12, right? 4 times 3, 4 cards in hand, all block for 3. You have a value of 12. Is that about average?
I think for limited, it's around a good limited deck. You're trying to get around 13 value per hand. Basically, each card's worth around 3, and then your action point's usually worth 1 point, because a lot of base rate cards like Red Wounding Blow, the 0 for 4 with no go again. That's kind of just at rate, you spend 1 card in your action point for 4 damage. Or Raging Onslaught Red is another example where you spend 2 cards in your action point for 7 damage. So a good limited deck is around 13 per hand cycle, and then constructed obviously pushes that quite a bit higher. You look at 14 plus damage per turn cycle from an average constructed deck.
Yeah, what do you think is a threshold that constructed decks actually need to strive for nowadays? Because I think in the past, I remember at actually the first constructed calling me and Sasha, when we were looking at the current mid-range decks available and potentially playing an aggro deck, we would have done anything to find a deck that could hit 14 consistently. I think nowadays that 14 value might be a little low for the top constructed decks in the meta.
Yeah, I would agree that 14 is probably a little low for if you look at the top aggro decks like Briar and Fi, their average undisrupted 4-card hands put out reasonably more than 14 damage. Obviously, some of their weaker hands do less than that, but their big hands do significantly more than that. Go ahead.
No, I was saying that's super interesting, right? The actual number value you're giving to that, I don't think people sit down and break that down very often for even just an aggro deck, which is like probably you'd say like level 1 to where you could do that, right? Like it's if you play 4 cards out, that's really obvious, right? It's on the face of the cards.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess an example of maybe not an average Briar hand, but a pretty good Briar hand would be a fused red Bramble Spark, which is worth 4, into red Earthlore Surge, which is worth 5, but it costs 2 resources. And then you play one of your many 0 for 4s. I wrote down Snatch in the show notes as my example, but it'll get Go Again from the embodiment, and it's going to come in for 4 points of value on its own. And if you ignore the on hit, then you can just say it's 4. And then Rosetta Thorn as the last action is 4. And you spend 4 cards there and you deal 17 damage. And that's kind of a pretty good Briar hand. And that's ignoring the on hit from Snatch. But that's kind of like what the constructed decks are looking for their best hands to do that kind of damage, which ends up being 4.25 damage per card.
Yeah, and this is 17 damage purely off attacking, right? So purely off aggression. Do you think in Flesh and Blood that the ability to defend with cards in hand and to quote unquote fatigue has become less effective because the aggressive sort of value that you can get out of your hand has become so high, right? So we see a play there that actually isn't too unreasonable, putting out 17. We had things like Channel Mount Heroic onto that. We see numbers much, much higher. Your blocking for 3 is kind of a standard block value. There are some 0 for 4s and defense reactions, but it does seem like maybe the aggressive cards are starting to outpace the defensive values offered by a lot of cards.
Yeah, and a lot of the defensive cards do kind of get there in terms of value. If you look at Staunch Response, it's 2 resources in a card for 7 block. So if you can convert that last resource off a blue pitch into 1 more point, you're getting 2 cards for 8 points of defense, which definitely rivals this pretty good aggressive hand. But the problem is that these defense reactions are so narrow. You can't, like, if I just present a bunch of damage to you, maybe it'll be broken up into several small chunks. Maybe it'll be 1 big chunk. Whereas Staunch Response, it can only cover up 1 attack. So that 1 attack has to be for 7 damage. Otherwise, you won't get full value out of your card.
You can see that with it. I think Rosetta Thorn's a really good example of how split damage is so impactful in a game like Flesh and Blood, and what you just talked about, Michael, as opposed to being on the offensive versus the defensive. Rosetta Thorn is always going to split that damage up and force your opponent to deal with it. And the defensive cards aren't, you can't have that decision to split stuff up. It's not as easy. I actually wanted to, because Brendan, you talked about something at the start. You said it's a boomer thing to talk about synergy, but I actually think like even you go like pre-boomer, I'm going to say pre-boomer, we're talking like turn of the century stuff here. It was about like the value you could get out of your cards. That's what Welcome to Wraith was about. But if you could find 13, 14 on a turn cycle, you were like cheering. Like I think you talked about fatigue just then. Fatigue was like a real thing because the defensive cards haven't really changed that much. Like they have a bit, and you've got hero abilities that change that, think Ultim. But, we had Sink Belows, we had Unmovables, we had Staunch Response, we had all these cards. It just, the output on the other side wasn't really there. And I think that's what's changed about the game now is output on offense is a lot higher. Average card value you can get on offense is a lot higher.
Does make me wonder if Drone of Brutality would still be as impactful if it existed today.
Still be pretty good, I think.
I was not around for Drone of Brutality. I think it wouldn't be as dominant now as it maybe, or as powerful now as it was back then. I don't think it leads to great play patterns anyway, though. So if it is good enough, it seems like a bigger mistake to have it be legal than not.
Yeah. So Michael, I'm kind of grasping this concept now, like even from a very basic level, right? I'm looking at the cards in my hand and evaluating sort of my turn cycle value. How do I utilize this strategically, and what am I trying to do in a game of Flesh and Blood to take that concept and employ it most effectively?
So your goal is to maximize the damage per card you get while minimizing your opponent's, or the value per card more than the damage. So aggressive decks they're just mostly just trying to play out their hand in the most optimal way possible. They don't usually block as much because usually they're getting more than the 2 or 3 points that it would get for blocking on offense. There are some pretty big exceptions to that. If you're playing an aggro deck and you have a card in Arsenal and they play Command and Conquer, suddenly you're like looking at your 2 cards that block for 3, that would probably be worth 4 points each on offense, but maybe it's worth giving up those 2 points of value because you'll protect this Arsenal card. And if you lose the Arsenal card, it's probably going to be worth the Arsenal card's probably worth more than 2 points of value. So suddenly it's more efficient to block with them. And you just like have to calculate that kind of thing out for everything your opponent's doing. You look at your hand initially and you're like, if my opponent doesn't present any on hits and I can just use my hand as efficiently as I want to, how can I best spend my hand? And a lot of the time that's blocking with 0 or 1 cards and play 0 cards or 1 card and then playing your cards out offensively. And so that's why on hits are kind of effective against these aggro decks that are looking to play bigger hands. You saw at the Pro Tour in Lille, you saw a more aggressive version of Oldheim doing very well against the Briars of the field because they were playing a bunch of on hits and forcing Briar to block with her hand that she didn't really want to block with because they were worth more points on offense than defense. But these on hits basically made it so they were more efficient to defend with them instead of attack with them because the cost of letting the on hit effect happen was more than the value you'd get from saving the cards for offense.
Do you have a way of quantitatively evaluating a card like Command and Conquer? So it's effectively a 2-card 6, right? But there is a disruptive effect. Do you is there a numerical value that you assign to that disruptive effect? Because of course it is also sometimes irrelevant, right? The opponent does not have an arsenal or something like that. Would Command and Conquer be a 2-card for 6, or would you maybe consider a 2-card for 7 or for 8? Like, how is there a quantitative way of like really just kind of bringing that down to the numbers? So when I'm putting it in my deck, I'm trying to look at the value of my hand, rather it being 12 because I have something like Command and Conquer, would I consider it like 14 because of the effect?
I think I would still consider it 2 cards for 6, which is actually below rate because it's 2 cards in your action point for 6. And that's part of why I didn't end up in my Icelander deck is because it's, I think it's below rate basically compared to these other cards. The upside of it disrupting your opponent's turn is very powerful though. And rather than saying that you're getting value out of that, it's really contextual based on like what your opponent wanted to do with their hand. So maybe your opponent has an arsenal they care about and they have 2-3 blocks that they want to block with on the card. If they wanted to block with those 2-3 blocks anyway, if that was the most efficient way to use their hand, say maybe they're like a Bravo or something and they want to block with 2 cards and swing a 3 for 7 or swing an Anathos or something, then you're not getting any extra value out of this on hit from the Command and Conquer. When you are getting value is like the example I gave earlier where the Briar has to block with 2 cards that would be worth 4 damage on offense and they're only worth 3 blocking. So it's really hard to give a blanket statement for how much value this Command and Conquer is worth. It's literally just you're 2-card 6ing them, and then you're also causing them to use their cards less efficiently a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about decks that play a package like Belittle, and in order to facilitate playing something Belittle Minnowism, they play maybe like Yellow Snatch, like some of these cards that are definitely below rate, but they satisfy Belittle's cause and allow the player to go fetch an additional card in the form of Minnowism.
So Belittle by itself is a pretty crazy rate. It's either 1 resource for 6 damage split up between the attack and non-attack getting a red Minnowism, or it's basically -2 resources for 3 damage and a card. And both those rates are very, very good. And that's why Belittle's seen a lot of success over its lifespan, I guess, its continued lifespan. And because it has a lot of deck building requirements as well, and it doesn't always get the full value out of it, but the ceiling of Belittle is very high, and that's kind of why it's good. I think on rate, you can just always say that Belittle is worth what it's worth when you're doing the thing where you're getting your Minnowism and getting full value out of it. So I would say Belittle is it's probably worth 1 or 2 points more than like your average constructed level card. But the way you figure out if Belittle is worth it in your deck is you look at all the cards you're playing instead of the better cards, and is Belittle giving enough value to warrant basically making those sacrifices? And that's kind of an ongoing question in many different decks. And it also depends on how much you have to block, because if you're in a format where your opponent's presenting a lot of on hits, suddenly Belittle looks a lot worse. It blocks for 2, and it really needs a 2 or 3 card, sometimes 2 if it's an arsenal, 2 cards plus an arsenal, but it really needs a 3-card hand to like do anything basically. So Belittle's value kind of fluctuates based on how many important on hits there are in the metagame, I think.
It's like a contrast to Command and Conquer you just talked about before. It's like the opposite side of the spectrum, right? Because actually, I wanted to go back to the Command and Conquer piece because I think it's super interesting the way you talked about that, and it's something that I think I've thought about in the past, but I want to elaborate a little bit more on with you, Michael. Is like you play the CNC, you say it's 2 cards for 6, right? It takes your action point. I think the thing that on the other side of it for your opponent is, okay, and you said it's contextual to your opponent, but I think you can have a little bit of, from my perspective, anyway, I think you could probably have a little bit of numerical value to a degree, depending on what you're playing. So if you know that you think you're playing against a Briar, they can on average make their offensive cards with 4, let's say, based on what you're talking about before. I think you said 4.25 in that Briar specific turn you showed. If you're able to force them to block to protect that card in Arsenal, that's going to offer them, say, 4.25 damage, whatever it is. Now you've taken 2 cards from their hand and reduced the value to 3, right? So your CNC is, you could some ways say, look at it, well, you've paid 2 cards for 8, right? You've saved potentially 2 damage on the offense. And on the flip side, if they give up that card and they just take the 6 damage, what's the value of that card? You could probably say it's somewhere between 2 to 3, right? That you've just traded for. So again, you're trading up, and that's where the impact of CNC comes in on the flip side of that, which you just talked about, right? I just want to go back to that because I think you made an amazing example with Briar, and I feel like you can make the flip side on CNC. And I think, Brendan, I don't want to jump ahead, but the value of a non-hit effect, I think, is one of the most interesting and hard to grasp concepts in this game. I think you snatch, CNC, whatever it is.
Yeah, definitely. I sort of want to dig into, what is your process, Mike, when you approach building a new deck? So I think a good example of this is the Icelander deck, what looked like on the surface level a very synergistic deck, right? What's the balance between synergy? So, I mean, some cards I would look at in the Icelander deck that are kind of purely based off synergy would be something like Frostex, right? Like, it now is somewhat niche useful with the Oldhim decks getting very aggressive, and it forwards this sort of combo game plan. But you added a lot of cards into that deck that were just pure value, right? Like Fandal's Fighting Spirit Red, Wounded Bull, Sink Below. What is the balance between sort of, I'm trying to get the most quantitative value out of my hand turn by turn, versus how much of like a synergistic game plan do you want with the rest of your deck? You want like X number of ice cards to fuse with. You want to be able to play your Aether Ice Veins. You want to be able to combo. You want X number of blues. How do you balance that?
Well,
Small question.
There's not really an easy answer to that. It's basically me and Roger kind of just did an episode on deck building on the Manor podcast, and we kind of talked about this stuff a little bit. But like, your goal when building a deck is kind of figuring out what your weakness is. And one thing that kind of led me to cut Command and Conquer from Icelander was the deck was not lacking in disruption. It had plenty of disruptive effects, and a lot of the time, when I switched to Finals, Fighting Spirit, and Wounded Bull, people would still block those with 2-3 blocks and just take 1 or 2 damage. Whereas if I was playing Command and Conquer and they'd block that with 2 cards, then I'd get no damage through. So it was just, they're already very encouraged to block it out because of the extra disruption that Icelander has at instant speed from Arsenal. Is if you keep your hand, you don't know if you're going to be able to get full value out of your cards anyway. So there's like extra risk to doing it. And at that point, if your opponent wants to block your attacks anyway, you might as well just play the more efficient attack rather than the on hit. As far as synergy versus power, I think you'd basically try to find the strongest cards that fit the synergy role. And then you compare those to cutting the synergy stuff and just playing raw power. And you honestly just have to play. The way I do it is I play games with both versions, and I see which side is getting me better rates throughout the course of the game. Like, one example of synergy would be in the Oldhim deck where we had Command and Conquer with Pummel with the Tunic counter. That's a very powerful synergy, but it's also like that because the synergy is so strong, you get there, you're well above the rate that you would need for a combination of cards to be good. And you can kind of just look at the rate that you get when you assemble the synergy, and then look at the fail case of the cards. In a world where you don't have that synergy, what are the cards doing? Well, Red Pummel's blocking for 2, so it's pretty bad, but you can still use it with some of your other cards. It doesn't have to pair up with Command and Conquer. You can still play it with Endless Winter or Chokeslam or Spinal Crush or Erase Face or lots of other cards. So it's probably good enough to warrant. And then Command and Conquer is it looks pretty good in Oldheim because Oldheim just wants to slow the game down. He wants your opponent, if your opponent's blocking with 2 cards for 6, then that's not a great rate, but that's getting you closer to your second cycle, getting you closer to Oak and Old, Fused, getting you closer to getting your Pulse to get your combo react and get lots of value. And it's also getting you closer to fatiguing your opponent, which is a threat that even the more aggressive Oldheim decks still have over their opponent, is they kind of threaten to fatigue them. And because of that, I think both pieces are fine on their own. And then the combination of having them together is very, very powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So do you want to take us through some kind of specific examples, specific, deck and card examples to sort of hammer home what value looks like, right? We've talked about kind of a few scenarios, but I think a few more might help sort of solidify how to evaluate a 4-card hand during a turn cycle to see if you're getting more value than your opponent.
Yeah. So one example would be, I should have wrote down his last name, Dan Rakowski.
Yeah, that's his last name. Yeah.
Okay, Dan Rakowski's spy deck from Nationals, and it had a lot of different ways hands could play out to be like very efficient. So first, this kind of comes up in limited 5, but it also in his deck, it has a ton of ways to do a 2-card hand for 7 damage, where it plays a 0-cost starter into Searing Emberblade and to pay 1 to get back the Phoenix Flame, attack for 1. So that's 2 cards for 7 damage. If you block with your other 2 cards and they're 3 blocks, then you're getting 13 damage from a hand cycle. That's not great, but it's fine. Now, if you take that 2-card 7 and instead of blocking with maybe a Lava Burst, instead you play Lava Burst at the end, you're playing the Lava Burst for 5 extra damage. So you play your 0 for 3 starter, and then you pitch a blue to attack with Searing Emberblade. You get back your Phoenix Flame, and then you attack with Lava Burst. That's worth 12 damage now. And that's 3 cards for 12. If your other card blocked for 3, that's a 4-card of hand of 15 value. And additionally, equipment kind of factors into this. If you have Tiger Stripe Shiko, suddenly the Lava Burst worth 1 extra damage on top of that, and it's a 4 cards for 16 points of value.
Yeah.
Which is something that Fi can do pretty consistently if he has a Lava Burst and a 0 for 3 starter and a blue, that's not a huge ask. That's what the deck's built to do.
Yeah, so it's sort of it's almost average turns are hitting those values, while it has this sort of nuclear opage at the same time where it plays something like an Art of War and reaches these kind of ridiculous amounts of damage it's able to put on the opponent. So yeah, a very, very efficient deck for sure. What are your thoughts, just to quickly get your thoughts, because we have you here. What are your thoughts on the recent success of the sort of Mask of the Pouncing Lynx and quote-unquote combo Fi deck that Peter won Battle Hardened Dallas with? Have you had a chance to see that list yet?
I'm honestly not very familiar with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll be interested to see, because, Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, it seems like as an equipment, can be quite strong. Obviously, you have Mask of Momentum there, threatening the draw trigger. Mask of the Pouncing Lynx often being worth, almost always being worth more than 5 damage as a permanence that sits on the battlefield. Quite powerful.
6 is a good number.
Yeah.
To start on the field.
Getting a Lava Burst or Assault the Wounds on Art of War turn is usually worth about 6. So
yeah. How would you evaluate Art of War specifically?
I think Art of War is actually one of the most powerful cards in the game. Specifically, it costs 1 resource, and then you play this Art of War and you banish a card. But you're drawing 2 cards, so it kind of replaces both the Art of War and the card you banished. Outside of Chain or other decks that care about the banish zone, like Chain and Levia, break it even further. But in a normal deck where you're banishing a card and playing a card and spending 1 resource to give your whole turn +1 power and draw 2 new cards. So it kind of goes 1 resource for +1 power on every card you play this, or every attack you play this turn. So the cards that you draw are random. So like it can be harder to most efficiently use your hand. Like maybe if you knew those were the 2 cards you draw, you'd block with one of those 2 cards if you could, but you can't do that. So you won't always get full value to the 2 cards you block. But you can say that Art of War is 1 resource for however many attack actions you play that turn is how much value you're getting out of it. And on top of that, it also can help push through on hits or even be a combat trick on that first card or hit, make breakpoints even more awkward. But I think the easiest way to look at it is just you're spending one resource, you're breaking even in cards, and you're dealing 1 damage per attack. So it's probably worth, if you play 4 attacks that turn, it's 1 resource for 4 damage, which is 1 resource is about a third of a card. So that's essentially valuing it at 1 card would be worth 12 damage, which is very, very powerful. Far above the rate of anything else.
Michael, I want to ask you just while we're here, I want to segue and Brennan, if you want to leave this further down the line, then please do. But you talked about breakpoints just then and out of void helping breakpoints. How do you value breakpoints in Flesh and Blood? I think it's a question that people ask, even if they don't know they're asking it. I think they're probably subconsciously asking it when they're looking at cards, when they're looking at their draft decks, when they're looking at their constructed decks, their blitz decks. This idea of breakpoints, and I think you just talked about Dan's deck, the fire deck. That's predicated around a lot of breakpoints. You know, he's playing things like Soaring Strike to make sure he can get his snatch go again because it has a breakpoint with an on-hit effect. Like, how do you value those kinds of things in Flesh and Blood?
So, a breakpoint is essentially, it's not inherently worth anything because if your opponent says no blocks on it, they don't care about the breakpoint, then you're just getting whatever the value of the card is. So if you play Wounding Blow, it's 0 for 4. 4 is kind of a weird breakpoint, but it's still just one card in your action point for 4 damage. If you attack with Kodachis, then it's still just 1 resource for 1 damage, which is, again, about on rate for limited, a little bit worse than you expect in constructed. And these breakpoints don't matter until your opponent is blocking them inefficiently. So if your opponent spends a full card to block a Kodachi, suddenly this breakpoint was super relevant because they spent a whole card to prevent 1 damage, which means you aren't getting any more value out of your cards, but you're lowering the value of your opponent's cards. And you can kind of equate that to getting more value out of your cards because, again, it's like zero sum. It's just like you're winning each turn cycle by X amount or losing each turn cycle by X amount. So like reducing the value of your opponent's cards is very good. It's basically the same as getting more value out of your cards. But in a vacuum, your cards aren't, like, having breakpoints isn't actually worth anything naturally, if that makes sense. It's just when your opponent needs to block them because they have an on-hit ability, like Red Snatch attacks for 4, and if they don't block it, you're going to draw a card. Red Mounting Anger attacks for 4. If they don't block it, you're going to give something +1 damage, so it's worth an extra damage if it hits. And go ahead.
I want to ask you just on that, how big is the difference between a red and yellow snatch then? I know Brendan talked about yellow snatch before, talked about red snatch. How big is the difference then? If the breakpoint inherently is worth nothing, how big is the difference of that card? Is it just one difference then in terms of value?
In a vacuum, it's worth 1 damage. If you look at a lot of the decks in the format and maybe they don't have a lot of 1-block equipment that they want to throw in front of Snatch, they don't have a lot of cards that naturally block for 4, like Brother in Arms and Sink Below, then suddenly this 1 point of damage is frequently making your opponent block with 2 cards instead of being able to single card block it. And then if they're blocking with 2 cards or they're blocking with a 3-block and a 2-block piece of armor on your Snatch, you're getting a lot of extra mileage out of that 1 damage breakpoint. But it's very contextual based on what tools your opponent has to block it. So if you're against a deck with 3 copies of Sink Below, 3 copies of Fate Foreseen, 3 copies of Brother in Arms, and a bunch of equipment that blocks for 1, then it's just worth 1 damage. It's not worth anything else. But in those spots where it does cause your opponent to block with 2 cards or block in a way that makes their cards more inefficient than the yellow Snatch would, then suddenly you're reducing the value of your opponent's turn by a lot more than you would, which is worth value.
Yeah. It's I kind of look at it as paradoxical. I think it depends, right? It's so hard to say one way or the other, but like you say, at face value, inherently not worth anything, but also it could be.
Yeah.
So I want to back up to sort of a key example, which is Wounded Bull Icelander. Can you talk to me about why Wounded Bull Icelander is good? Why is it so much better than the other versions of Icelander? No, but just talk to me about what makes that deck so effective? You're putting attack actions in Icelander, not something that would have immediately come to mind when picking up a wizard.
Yeah, so the main reason that it's good to have these attack actions in your deck is actually just that the arcane damage spells aren't very strong on rate. You could play like Red Aether Hail into Waning Moon is 2 cards for 6 damage and your action point, which is not a good rate. That's not something you want to be doing in Classic Constructed. Red Ice Bolt, even worse, 2 cards for 5 damage, and you need a Tunic counter to make it 7 damage. But if you don't have a Tunic counter, it's just 2 cards for 5 damage, which is quite bad. And those are kind of the main spells you're giving up by applying these attack actions. You're also losing Freezing Point, but that card is a lot trickier because it's very contextual on how much damage you get based on how many permanents your opponent has that are frozen, or how many Frostbites they have and how many Frost Hexes they have. So that one's a little bit trickier to evaluate, but looking at the attack actions, like Wounded Bull, you spend 2 cards, you get 8 damage, and comparing that to Red Aether Hail, where you spend 2 cards and you get 6 damage, it's just very clearly that Wounded Bull is more efficient to be attacking with. And these other cards, like these ice actions, have other benefits, like you can overpitch them to keep Channel Lake Frigid around longer. They block for 3, whereas Wounded Bull only blocks for 2. And sometimes you're not behind your opponent in life total, and Wounded Bull is only at 2 cards for 7, which is not nearly as good as 2 cards for 8. And then the final thing that they're better at is most of the time it's harder to block arcane damage than physical damage, which kind of jumps back into that other point of you want to make your opponent unable to use their cards efficiently. You want to make them use their cards inefficiently, but most of the time the most efficient use of cards isn't blocking with them anyway. As we were talking about. So
blood. Yeah, so I mean, Icelander's bringing together sort of when you have cards like Wounded Bull in it, it's getting this very good rate on its 2 card for 8, but at the same time has access to a lot of disruptive cards, right, in the form of Blizzard, Hypothermia, even things like Channel Lake Frigid, and then of course there's, I guess, a sort of derivative of disruption is Frost Hex and combo against decks that would try to go slow against you. So you sort of have a package to attack those other 2 pillars of the meta, whether it's being like a defensive ultim deck, which is going to try to fatigue you out, or a go again deck, which is Phi, Briar, Chain, no, not Chain anymore, Chain and Blitz, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. And then one final thing that I think, but all versions of Icelander probably include, but I think it's worth mentioning just while we're talking about the rate of cards. When you play a Polar Blast or a Cold Snap from Arsenal on your opponent's turn by pitching a blue, you give them a Frostbite, and then you have 2 resources floating to Waning Moon. So you're getting a Frostbite and 3 damage for pitching a blue and playing a card, but they both draw you a card. So you're pitching a blue, playing a card, and replacing that card. So a Frostbite and 3 damage, you can say that Frostbite's worth 1 resource for your opponent. That's pretty efficient. That's probably worth about 4 points of damage. So both those cards are also very efficient.
Mm. So there's I hesitated to actually to not paraphrase this, but I guess I'll say it verbatim off your notes. It says Rhinar sucks and only boomers like to play him. I feel like that was directed at Hayden. Do you want to sort of defend that statement? Why is Rhinar bad?
So I did not say Rhinar sucks. I said Rhinar struggles in a lot of metas. And
so political.
I think so Rhinar has a mechanic called Intimidate, where ideally you are taking away your opponent's cards they want to use to block and causing them to be inefficient because of that. And when you intimidate cards your opponent wanted to block with, maybe they have maybe they're playing a Bravo deck and they want to block with 3 different 3 blocks, and they want to use their last card to swing Anathos for 4. And when you intimidate 2 of those 3 blocks that he can now no longer use to block, suddenly his game plan has to be different, and maybe his turn becomes less efficient because of that. And Rhinar's Intimidate mechanic is very good in a metagame where people have specific cards they want to block with and specific cards they want to get back to their turn with. But as long as I've played Flesh and Blood, most of the decks in the format are trying to play 4-card hands fairly frequently. And because of that, a lot of the time when you intimidate some of their cards, they're like, well, I wasn't going to block with that anyway, so I don't care. And if you look at just the raw rate on some of Rhinar's cards, I think one that springs to mind is Alpha Rampage. It costs 3 resources and you discard a card. So it costs a blue card because it's 3 resources. It costs a random discard and then it costs itself that you're playing, and it costs your action point, and it attacks for 9, and it intimidates once or twice if you trigger Reinhardt's hero power. But if that intimidate's not worth anything, spending 3 cards for 9 damage, 3 cards in an action point for 9 damage, that's even a little bit below rate for limited. And constructed, that's definitely not where you want to be. So blocking with, maybe you block with a 3 card or a 3 block card and then do that, you're getting 12 value out of your 4 cards, 12 value out of your turn cycle. And that's not going to compete with the things that other constructed decks are doing. And I think that's part of why Reinhardt struggled quite a bit, is unless this intimidates really interrupting your opponent's plan and causing inefficiencies, most of Reinhardt's cards aren't good enough.
But if I put on my sort of, copium glasses here, I would say Blood Rush Bellow, Swing Big, Romping Club, these are above rate. These few cards that my class has access to.
Yeah, and all 3 of those cards are very, very good and very, very powerful. And a lot of Reinhardt's best turns involve Blood Rush Bellow or Swing Big or a combination of both, because they're the best rate you can get on a card or on cards in Reinhardt. If you look at Blood Rush Bellow, I was talking about how Art of War, you're spending a resource and 2 cards to get 2 new cards and give all of your attacks +1 for the turn. Well, Blood Rush Bellow is the same thing, but it's +2 for each card for the turn. So if there's any broken card in Reinhardt, it's probably Blood Rush Bellow, because it's just a better version of Art of War. The problem is when all of your cards are 1 or 2 points below rate anyway, getting this +2 on everything looks a lot worse. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, my theory is that Hayden plays Reinhardt, and quantitatively he may be getting a value of 10 to 12 out of his hands, and trying to keep up with the other big boys in class constructed, but he is able to make up that difference with happiness. So it's a +3 to +3.5. So he nets around occasionally a 15.5 turn, which is a win, right, Hayden?
I would say, and depending on the build, you can net that a bit more frequently. The problem is, like Michael said, it is like it's the on hit the breakpoint discussion from before. It's the same thing with Intimidate. Intimidate isn't a mechanic that has a natural value to it. Like I think you could use Boost as like a example to go side by side. Like Boost gives you Go Again, gives you an action point, which is like worth something in a deck, right? Like that you can like a lot more quantitatively try to like hold on to what that is. Intimidate really doesn't, because like Michael said, either maybe they don't care, and if they don't, then your mechanic, which you've paid value for, because look at the rate of return on cards in Brute, like that, anything that says Intimidate on it, there's value taken away. So like a Smash Instinct, right, is a 3 for 7 red, but it's a class red, so really it should be 3 for 8, but it has Intimidate on it. So you're paying effectively like 1 damage for that Intimidate anyway, and if you're getting nothing back for it, you just handicapped yourself. I think that's what you're talking about a little bit about, to sort of below rate. There's cards that are below rate, but then there's cards that are above rate, and there's things that you can do above rate. You come in with a Romping Club, so you play a 2-card hand, red, barrage, and beatdown, pitch your yellow, come in for Romping Club. Potentially that's a 2 for 8, but also potentially it's just 2 for 6, because your opponent blocks with 2 3 blocks, or worse, it's they just throw two blocks at you and they don't really care about them, for example. So there's such a wide like range of where Brute can play, and it's really hard to play consistently. I will small plug the deck that I played in the Goliath Gauntlet was a bit more based on, I think, being a bit more consistent, just because this meta kind of rewards it a bit more, I think, and Intimidate can, if you say to your opponent, you don't get to play the last turn of the game because you actually make your Intimidate worth something, you can make your Intimidate worth, each Intimidate can be worth 3 to 4 damage on the last turn of the game, because you deny your opponent the ability to block with that card. That is huge. That is where Intimidate really shines. But yeah, I mean, 6, 7, 8 of the 9 turns of the game when Intimidate doesn't matter, that's what hampers Reinhardt, and you lose value over the game. So it's what it is. Romping Club, though. Romping Club is above rate, so.
Yeah. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us. I know personally, I'm actually most excited to sort of dig deeper into this concept and apply it to Limited. Because while I do think that I have done that in the past, I didn't explicitly look at value in Limited. I would probably try to go for a bit of synergy, a little bit too much. And I've definitely found recently, at least when I played Blitz this past weekend, it did feel like it felt like the most unfair thing I could do in Blitz was actually do the most fair thing and just get +1 or +2 over my opponent on a turn cycle. And yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that concept will absolutely be like it'd be 10x'd in something like limited.
Yep. You can go and apply it, and then everyone won't call you a dirty 5-forcer, Brendan.
I don't force fi. I want to force fi, but I ended up playing Icelander and losing. I'm joking.
But you can use the math for next time.
Yeah. Anyway, Michael, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's really interesting as I think yourself and people like Michael Thing have really been pushing this concept farther and farther and showing us how powerful it can be. I still remember the Calling Orlando when Hayden walked back from his round whatever match and comes back and tells me that he got outplayed by some Michael Hamilton guy. And I was like, okay, whatever you say. But it was pretty clear that even back then, this was sort of the ethos behind your deck building. So very, very strong concept. And yeah, I know it's something that Hayden and I are incorporating more and more into our deck building. It's not something we weren't before, but I think a re-emphasis and a refocus does us very well. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you back on the channel soon for maybe a deck guide as soon as you world champion Michael Hamilton, maybe.
That would be nice.
I'll fight you for it.
Yeah. Or Hayden can win. That would be cool too.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for having me on. It's always fun to come on here and chat with you both.
Awesome. I want to give you a chance to shout out any of your socials, your podcasts, all that good stuff.
All right. You can find me on Twitter at HadesBlade. And then me and Roger Bodie do the Manor podcast every week. It's another Flesh and Blood podcast aimed at helping you just get better at the game. And yeah.
Sweet. Well, I'm going to keep you on here while I close it out. So there's going to be no Google review for this week. But if you do want to submit a review and get it read out on the podcast, you can do that. ratethispodcast.com/ArsenalPass. We do really appreciate them. It helps a lot with SEO. Check out Arsenal Pass on YouTube. Like I said, deck techs, deck guides. Occasionally you'll see Michael Hamilton on there. Recently had the Reinhardt deck tech go up. So check that out. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Brendan APG. Hayden is at Fiendale, FIEN_Dale. Tweeting about all kinds of fab stuff. And then finally, just a big thank you to the Arsenal Pass patrons. And if you do want to see Hayden's deck guide for the Rhino deck, it is available completely free on patreon.com/Arsenal Pass. So go check that out. Anyway, that's all for this week. See you all in the next episode.
See you later.